Hello, everybody. Hope you're well on this Sunday and ready for another full class, packed full. And ready to recall why we're even doing this, right? Why are we taking this class? Why are we taking this course? How is it going to help us in reaching our goals? The goal of a perfect world where everybody is at peace and happy and beauty all around us, where there is no suffering, right? So let's take a moment to imagine what that world will look like. It'll be a little different for each of us. Like, what's happening in our paradise? Who's there? What are they doing? Like, for one good friend of mine, I know there would be a lot of ice hockey in his paradise. Me, I don't think about ice hockey. In my paradise, there would be beautiful places to swim and hike. And so think about what your paradise will look like and what the feeling is there and who the beings are there. And then let us offer this paradise to every being in every universe. Sashi Puki Chukshing Metok Drum Rirab Lingji Ninde Gempadi Sange Shingdu Mikte Urwargi Jokun Namdak Shingla Chuparsho Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamniryatayami. And then our wish to become someone who can manifest, who can create, plant the seeds, and then have it blossom. That paradise for every being. Sange chudam soke chuknam lava. Jangchu pardu dakni kyapsuchi. Daki jinso ki pe sunam ki. Jola penchir sange drupar shok. Sange chudang soke chuknam ba. Jangchu pardu dakni kyapsuchi. Daki jinso ki pe sunam ki. Drola penchir sange drupar sho. Sange chutang soki chuknam la. Jangchu pardu dakni kyabsuchi. Daki jinso ki pe sunam ki. Jola penchir sange drupar sho. Oh, I didn't share my screen with you guys, did I? Excuse me. So hopefully you have that memorized by now. And but I'll try and remember to share the screen next time. So we are at class 7, moving right along here. And I can't say that it's gotten any easier. So just remember, Geshe, he only taught this course once and he hasn't taught it again. And why do we need this course? Because we need to understand all of the different ways of thinking about emptiness. So we need to read and understand what they're saying about emptiness. We are the lineage. We are the ones, I got it from Geshe Michael, and now I'm passing it on to you. And this is the way it's been done for generations and generations and generations. And we have to work a little, right? We have to work a little bit, especially with logic. I think most of us, some have really sharp minds and may not have to work as hard as some of the rest of us. So we have to work, and Geshe has worked really hard to make it easily digestible. And even so, it's still difficult, right? And it's also really important. So while you're doing the readings, while you're going through the readings, you want to pay particular attention to the middle of what we call the syllogism, to the middle of it. And why? Because that's where we present our own position, the Madhyamika Prasangika position, the most subtle understanding. And each of the debates, each of those syllogisms are a separate thing to learn. And, as we've been saying, if you only get through a few of them, that's okay. Don't worry. This is a book for life, right? And occasionally pull it off the shelf or open your computer up, right? And read one of the syllogisms, read one of the debates, and especially look for the middle section. And in the reading, they're divided with lines, so you can distinguish them pretty easily. And if you can just digest one or two and have, the rest to look at sometime later, that's okay. Go to the middle. Find where we present our own position. And then don't just skim over it, but as Ken Rinpoche would say, cook it. Chew on it, as the Lord Buddha would say, chew on it, burn it, hammer it. Make sure you understand it. And that's a lot easier, right? They all will make sense, even if they don't make sense now. And it's through that effort and through helping each other that we will gain understanding. And of course, planting the seeds to help someone understand something that they don't understand yet, that you could perhaps assist them in. So it's not just semantics, it's not just playing with words. Each one is very important. And each one is necessary for us to understand where we understand emptiness, what our position is. And I know for myself, I fluctuate through all the understandings of emptiness in any given day, right? Constantly, the highest view, the lowest view. So if we can even catch ourselves, what we're thinking at the moment, it's pretty incredible. And then check if you can catch yourself. Where do I stand on the ladder of my understanding of emptiness right now, right? So each one is a sacred experience. And if you take time to engage with that experience, it will give you a deep insight into something important. In the monastery, they would memorize all of these debates, right? You debate it, you go back and you memorize the parts you don't remember. You debate it, you forget it, you memorize it again, you debate it. And there's a real advantage to that, I think, because then it's something you can bring up at any moment, right? I don't know that I have the capacity to do that anymore in this life. I memorized poems when I was a kid. I didn't memorize syllogisms, but it's much harder for me to memorize things now. Even trying to memorize and learn Tibetan, I have some obstacles to it these days. And how important this is. In Howell, New Jersey, where Geshe Michael lived with his teacher, Ken Rinpoche, there were other teachers there. There was a Mongolian teacher, and his name was Geshe Kelden. And Geshe Kelden, he, when the Tibetans left their country, left and came to India, the temperature and the environment was very, very different. They came from a very high, dry altitude down to a much lower altitude, a lot more diseases for them, a lot more humid. And Geshe Kelden, he got tuberculosis when he moved to India, and he had to have one of his lungs cut out. He was also weak, very weakened by it, and he couldn't walk very easily for the rest of his life. And Geshe Michael went to him on his deathbed. I mean, he wasn't quite dying yet, but he was definitely on the way there. And in his deathbed, he is studying the Say Dura, the Dura that we're studying, right? One of them. And Geshe went in and he said, he, greeted him and asked him how he was. And, he saw that he asked him, what are you reading? And Geshe Kelden said, I'm reading the Say Dura. And Geshe was like, really? But Geshe, you're dying. Why are you reading a logic text for 15-year-olds? Right? And he says, this is the most important thing for understanding Madhyamika. And I want to be ready next life too. So he was dying. He was at the end of his life. And he is laying there on his back, reading the Say Dura. And he was just getting ready. He was planting the seeds for his next life. So, You'll never get a chance like this. So try to get it this time. You have it. I have it. Don't let it collect too much dust. Pull it out occasionally. It's really important stuff. So that's my cheerleader conversation with you this morning. And we're going to talk about contradiction and relationship today. That's today's torture. So everybody say gelndrel. There's a pre-nasal before the drel. Gelndrel, right? So it's gel and ndrel, ndrel. If it's without the n, the ng, without the n there, it becomes trel, which means the opposite of ndrel. So you have to be careful when you're pronouncing this one. And gel stands for gelwa. Gelwa means contradiction. And drel is short for drelwa, which means relationship. So that's today's topic. Okay. Gendrel. Gendrel. Gel is the study of when two objects are contradictory. Two objects are contradictory. And drel is a study of when two objects share a relationship. And we're going to explore the different kinds of contradiction and the different kinds of relationship. Both of them are very important for understanding emptiness and cause and effect and dependent origination. So what makes a thing gelwa? What makes a thing a contradiction? Two qualities make something gelwa. And gelwa will always be talking about two things. Whether two things contradict each other. So when you're talking about contradiction, by definition, you're talking about two separate things. Two things that are distinct from one another. Okay? That's called tade. Say tade. Separate or distinct. And there are debates about what the meaning of separate is and what the meaning of distinct is. So for instance, if something has a primary name or a main name and a secondary name, that doesn't make it distinct from itself. Say like Venerable Gyelse, and that, which is my ordained name, and my birth name, which is Gail Deutsch, they're referring to the same thing. I can't be distinct from myself. But Venerable Gyelse and the pen, are they distinct? They're tade. They're distinct, right? I just realized I don't have the chat up. Let me see if I can bring it up. I can't see where to access it right now. Okay, so we're distinct from each other because when you conceptualize the pen and me, right, Gyelse, the primary name is separate. So that is one way to describe Tade. Mainly, you can think separate or distinct from one another. Okay. So the first thing to have a contradiction between two objects is there have to be two objects. Pretty logical, right? There have to be two objects. You can't say there's a contradiction if there's not two things there. So in Buddhist logic, the word distinct or separate implies the existence of each one of those two things. That's a rule, okay? It's a rule. So when we say two things are distinct from each other, or when we say two things are separate from each other, we also are assuming that they exist. We're not talking about non-existent things. You can't say that something which doesn't exist contradicts something which does exist, because there's no distinction. There's no tade. There's nothing, there's no two objects, right? There's no distinction between them. There's only one object. And you can't discuss whether or not something which does exist contradicts something which doesn't exist, right? So that's a general rule. Whether or not existence itself exists is a big debate in Buddhism. Some texts say existing things which are separate, when we say tade, right? And yeah, some texts believe that's what we're talking about. So when we say tade or separate or distinct from each other, we're assuming that the two things exist. The second feature of contradiction is that there is no shitumpa. Say shitumpa. Shitun has multiple translations. Common locus, common status, and it just means one thing, which is A or B. Shi means foundation. Tun means harmony. One thing which can be both A and B, and it's always like that. Sometimes you might have A, B, C, or A, B, C, D, but it's one thing, which could be both of those things or more. And that's called shitumpa. Shitun mepa, as we see up here, right? Shitun mepa means it must, the mepa is a negative, and it means it must be that there is no one thing which can be both of them. So a true Gelwa, the ultimate meaning of contradiction, is that between two objects, both must be distinct from one another, separate from one another. There is no one thing which can be both. And that's a simplified version of the meaning of contradiction. In Buddhism, you can contradict one way and not the other way. You can say that A is contradictory to B, but B is not contradictory to A at the same time. Or you could say A shares a relationship with B, but B doesn't share a relationship with A. For example, a tree shares a relationship with its seed, right? This oak tree shares a relationship with its acorn, the seed that it came from. It's a relationship of a kind we call coming from its seed, right? The relationship of something that came from something else. So in Buddhism, the tree is related to the seed. There's a one-way relationship. Where's my cursor gone? There it is. We don't say that the seed, in fact, is related to the tree, because the seed which the tree came from didn't come from the tree. It will, of course, be a cause for another tree, but it's not, the tree did not produce the seed from which it came from. So there's only a one-way relationship. There is a relationship of the tree to the seed, but not the seed back to the tree. Okay? In Buddhism, it can be contradictory in one way and not contradictory the other way. A tree or seed A can contradict tree B, but tree B will not contradict A. I see Irina furrowing her brow. It's like, I don't know about this. The tree came from the seed, right? But the seed that produced the tree did not come from the tree. It came from some other tree. So there's a relationship between the tree and the seed, but it's contradictory from the seed to the tree. Okay. Cook it. So no one thing can be both of them. A contradicts B. B is not contradictory to A at the same time. Okay. A shares a relationship with B, but B doesn't share a relationship with A. So we're going to talk about, we're still talking about contradictions. There are two kinds of contradictions. The first one we're going to talk about is pensum pengel. Say pensum, pangel. Utpala, please correct me if I pronounce it wrong. My language supporter here and editor. So she's much more fluent in this than I am, and I lean on her for that. So Pensun means, it's the first kind of contradiction, and it means mutually, right? And Pang means to eliminate. Gyal, we know, means contradiction. So Pensun Pang Gyal means a kind of contradiction where the two things are mutually exclusive. No one thing can be both. Red can't be blue at the same time that it's red. Or we could say mutually exclusive, they can't be both. Changing thing and unchanging thing. They are contradictory. Why? Oh, didn't mean to go there. Hold on, let me go back. Why are they contradictory? You could never find a shitumpa. You could never find one thing that is both changing and unchanging. So anytime we talk about contradiction in Buddhism, we're talking purely and wholly one thing and wholly the other. Are blue and red contradictory? Eka is saying yes. Yeah. In Buddhism, we say they're contradictory because they are. It means it cannot be all blue and all red at the same time. Right? No one object can be all blue and all red at the same time. So those two colors, as you can see, and it makes our eyes pop out, right, are contradictory. So I don't know who was in translator's class yesterday, but in Venerable Utpala's text, we talked about the sutra, What I Really Meant, claiming that all things have a self-nature, and the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra saying nothing has a self-nature. And in her homework question, she asked what the problem is with a person holding both of those at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. You can't hold those two ideas at the same time. You can't say that something is self-existent and not self-existent at the same time. You could flip back and forth, right? But at the same time, no. So that's the first kind of contradiction. There's a special kind of contradiction where when you perceive one of them, it automatically excludes the other one. When one of them is present, it automatically excludes the possibility of the other's presence. And that's what Pensun Pangel should be. It just means that one thing cannot be both. Like all things having a self-nature. Right? And having no self-nature at all. It automatically excludes them not having a right self-nature. Another example would be a water pitcher and everything that is not a water pitcher. A boompa and everything that is not a boompa. And we'll get into this a little deeper. And that is what is called a totality pensum pangel. And what does that mean? It means there's nothing else in existence besides those two things. One of them is the opposite of the other. So, considering all things in existence, the pen, right? Here's my pen. And everything which is not the pen, the door, the wall, me, you, it covers everything in the universe. That's one kind of Gelwa. There are other kinds of Gelwas, like heat and cold, or hot and coldness. No one object can be hotness and coldness at the same time. But there are other objects in the universe which are not hotness and coldness, right? One person could be a tantric deity and a demon to two different people. But that doesn't mean that those two things are not contradictory. So, talking about hotness and coldness, absolute coldness and absolute heat as absolutes, right? There are direct contradictions, which that one is, and indirect contradictions. So we're now breaking down contradictions, mutually exclusive contradictions. In the case of Penson Pangel, a direct one would be a water pitcher, as I said before, and everything which is not a water pitcher. An indirect one would be Takpa and Japa. Takpa meaning an unchanging thing, and Japa meaning a thing which is made. Takpa is directly contradictory to what? I wish I could somehow, I can't figure out now that I have my whole screen here, how to see the chat. There it is. Okay, let's pull that up. So what's the opposite of Takpa? Anybody remember? What is Takpa contradictory of? Me Takpa. Yeah, me Takpa. Thank you. Why? Because mentally, when we say contradictory, we're talking about how we think about things. When I say unchanging thing is directly contradictory to what you think? Yeah, changing thing. You think changing thing. And that's what we call a direct pensum pangel, a direct mutual exclusion. An indirect one is unchanging thing and a thing which is made. Why? Because a thing which is made is always a changing thing. And a changing thing is a direct contradiction of an unchanging thing. So we call that an indirect contradiction, an indirect mutual exclusion. So when we think, when we say what contradicts unchanging, and we say changing, can any one of those be both? Can any one thing both be unchanging and something which is made? You go through this mental process, right? I just saw Eka do it. She's thinking and then she shakes her head. You say to yourself, well, anything that's made must be changing. And I know that changing is the direct opposite of unchanging. So no, it's a contradiction. So we go through this process, this mental process to reach that. And then we come up with the answer. So when your mind says that contradicts unchanging directly, that's what we call a mutual exclusion, which is indirect. Another example would be takpa or nupo, right? An unchanging thing and a working thing, takpa and nupo. Is that direct or indirect? Indirect, yes. They are gugi pensen pangyalgyu, right? Meaning indirect. And this is in your reading. So I just want to point it out to you. What about these two on this slide? Nupo and nume. Nupo meaning a thing which does something, right? It's a working thing. And then nume meaning something which doesn't do anything, something which has no work. So when we say that, we're always implying an existing thing, not a non-existent thing, which does no work. You can't just say something which does not work, because things that don't exist at all, they don't do any work, right? Also, you always have to be careful when you're debating. You have to say an existing thing which does no work is the direct contradiction of a thing which does something. Remember, we have many words for working things. Working thing, changing thing, made thing. They all are the same semantically. They all point to the same thing, right? They're just different words for it. And each of those words produces a slightly different image depending on the person who hears the word, depending on, remember, dunchis, right? Depending on the dunchi you get, the mental image you get from each word is a little different, even though they all, even though they all refer to the same set of things. So it's semantic in that sense. What does it suggest directly to the mind? And each one of those three has a different, slightly different flavor. When you're discussing the quality, you're trying to prove they discuss. When you're discussing the quality you're trying to prove, let me put it, they discuss that distinction. Okay, you can go back and look at it. Even though working thing, changing thing, and thing which is made all refer to the same set of things. They give you a slightly different flavor, a different mental picture when you hear them. And what we're talking about here then, are the two mental pictures directly contradictory? That's what we're talking about. That's the distinction, those two mental pictures. And so that's the first kind of contradiction. Another pop-out slide. The second kind of contradiction, say lenchik, minegel. Lenchik minegel. Lenchik means to stay together. And you might remember the word lenke, meaning in one of your previous ACI courses, meaning a kind of ignorance which is you're born with. It's inborn. So Len has the meaning of two things which always come together. Plenchik means they stay together. Mine means they can't stay. They can't coexist. So Lenchik Mine means they cannot coexist together. Gel means, anybody remember Gel? Gel is contradiction, right? A contradiction which is diametrically opposed. So the definition of Lenchik Minegel, it's two things which conflict with each other. This will be on your homework. In such a way that they act against the continued existence of each other. Let me repeat it again. The definition of Lenchik Minegel is it's two things which conflict with each other. They contradict, they conflict, right? In such a way that they act against the continued existence of each other. A very silly example of this in the scripture is an ukpa and a charok. Ukpa means an owl. Charok means a cow. Supposedly, they don't get along and they don't like each other. And they can't stand on the same branch together. Now, I don't know how an ukpa and a charok could stand on a branch together, but when people teach this to children in the monastery, they say, hey, it's like an owl. Oh, I'm sorry. It's a crow, not a cow. Thank you. An owl and a crow. Why do they think cow? Charok is a crow. So when people teach this to the children, that an owl and a crow can't stand on the same branch together, they understand that they cannot coexist on the same branch. So that's a silly, lighthearted example in the scripture. The real example in scripture are Nyempo and Panja. Nyempo and Panja. So just a moment, let me get a drink. Nyempo means an antidote for something or a fix for something, a counter agent for something. So we can translate it, Nyempo, as a spiritual antidote. Panja means a negative quality of a person. Basically, it's a negative quality that we want to get rid of. So Pang means to get rid of something, and Pangja means to be gotten rid of. So for example, you had a hard time meditating every morning. Problem with lay low, with laziness. If that was a Pangja, something you wanted to get rid of, a good Nyempo would be a death meditation. Right? Realizing you don't know when death is coming. It could happen any moment. Do I want to waste my time looking at Instagram and TikTok? Right? Or sleeping? No, you have to get enough sleep. Just don't be obsessive about it. Or if you had a problem with desire for sense objects, there is a meditation called the skeleton meditation from the Abhidharma Kosha, right? Where you start with a tiny point in the center of the head, and you picture it as rotten, and then it starts to spread, and you let it spread and spread and spread until you can just see the bone. Say you're desiring, and you're desiring somebody else who looks incredibly sexy to you. This is a good meditation to go through, right? And then you let it rot, and then the skin peels off, and you keep going down through the whole body, right? And you see that it's just a skin covering, that underneath there's nothing, right? And then, in fact, you could let it spread out to the floor and the carpet, the chairs, everything is decaying. You see them rotting and falling apart, eaten by worms, the walls, etc., right? And then you destroy everything until you cover the whole planet, and then you bring it all back, and you come back to this little dot here. And that helps remove desire. They say this is the meditation to work on desire. When you kind of see everything as falling apart, then what is there to desire anymore? It's just going to all fall apart. So this second kind of contradiction, Lenchik Minegel, implies a process. It's described like the meditation I just described, the skeleton samadhi. In this meditation, skeleton meditation, the desire for the sense objects, someone else, your things, your world, the meditation encounters this desire. And there's an encounter, and then the meditation starts to work on the desire and wear it down bit by bit. And as the meditation gets stronger, your desire comes down. So it's a process where we start to work against the continued existence of the other, until finally one of them has overcome the other. So here, we have red and green, right? Neither of them is overwhelming the other yet. They're in balance. So it's a gradual process of encountering, working on it, and then removing it. Whereas mutual exclusion just means the minute this is red, it can't be green anymore. It immediately excludes the other. Right? So these are two different kinds of contradiction. The second one, in fact, is not a legal contradiction. Only the first one is the real meaning of contradiction. Generally, although we speak of two kinds of contradiction, the first one is the real one. So another example, which is a little harder. So back to Venerable Utpala's text. Can one state of mind be grasping to an object as self-existent, and at the same moment be understanding its emptiness perfectly? Is that possible? Yeah, impossible. You cannot be directly understanding a thing's emptiness and at the same time grasping to it as being self-existent. So when we get upset, what understanding do we have? Are we understanding its emptiness perfectly? No, they totally contradict each other. Yeah. Right, Pooh. So no one state of mind, meaning a millisecond state of mind, right? No one state of mind. And as I said before, you can alternate, right? But at that moment, at that millisecond, that you're understanding the emptiness of the thing, you can't get upset. You cannot at the same moment perceive it as being self-existent, as coming this way. When you're perceiving it and understanding it coming that way. So in that sense, those two states of mind are pensa panga, the first kind. They are mutually exclusive. But in the other sense, as a problem in your mind, as a problem in your life, as a problem in your ongoing mind stream, right? We're talking about the continuum of your mind. They are lenchik minegel. They are diametrically opposed. Like, I don't know if you've seen, I grew up watching Westerns as a kid on my black and white television. And, these two guys would be like in a place called Tombstone, which is near Diamond Mountain. And they would get out their 6-shooters, their guns, and they line up on the street and they'd say to each other, one of us has to go. This town ain't big enough for both of us. Right? It's like that. You can't go on thinking of things as self-existent. As your wisdom gets stronger and stronger, as your understanding that things are empty gets stronger and stronger, slowly the perception of them as self-existent has to start leaving town. This town ain't big enough for both of them, right? So first, They move a little further out of the center of town and then out to the suburbs, and then finally it has to leave altogether. And there is a period where one is working against the other. So it's a delicate example. It's an example of being both, in a sense, right? Relative to 1 millisecond of the mind, they are mutually exclusive. And you could call them pensen pangel. Right? Relative to a mental continuum, they are antidote and problem, and they are working against each other through a process. And that's called plenchik minegel. So that's a good example of both. Right? It's a good example. You can begin to see, I hope, how logic has purpose in helping us to get rid of our mental afflictions and understand how that happens. And our, I just lost my train of thought. Because I noticed there was a switch in translators. And how it helps us understand emptiness and perception, how we are seeing things, right? So on the homework, it'll say, give the 2 criteria to be contradictory. First of all, you have to say they're separate objects. Remember, they're separate objects. And they have to be such that no one thing can be both at the same time. Also, Geshe Michael threw in, they have to be existing things. Why did he throw that in? Because he wants us to know that in Buddhism, when we say separate, we're assuming existing objects. So in the first kachikma, in this, after the wrong Luke, we're talking about in this very reading, they come up, some person comes up and says, non-existent things are contradictory to existing things. And we have to say, no. Why do we have to say no? Because they're not distinct. Because they're not distinct objects. Because one of them isn't an object. One of them doesn't exist, right? Non-existent things are contradictory to existing things. Semantically, it sounds right. But think about it. How can something that doesn't exist be contradictory to something that does exist? Right? You have to think about it. The definition of existence, remember, is that which you can perceive with a valid perception. And the text, interestingly enough, from Sarah doesn't give all this detail, but the one from Drepung Monastery does. And in the Drepung scripture, which is the Sedura, they also divide that Lenchik Minegel into direct and indirect. So an example of a direct contradiction for Lenki Minegel is either they don't get along with each other, where they stop each other's continued existence, or they work against each other's continued existence. For example, light and darkness. When you turn on the light, it encounters the darkness, and then there's a process of the light removing the darkness. And that is a direct contradiction of diametric opposites, as opposed to a direct contradiction of mutually exclusive. We're talking about in the context of turning on a light. We can say the same thing for hot touch and cold touch. If the room is cold and you turn on the heat, this tangible object called warmth removes the tangible object called cold. And when you say tangible object, you're talking about one person. So that's direct contradiction. What about indirect contradiction? Okay, we can see here, there are huge clouds of smoke. So huge clouds of smoke and a feeling of coldness at a certain place, on a certain mountainside. You know, there are these huge billowing clouds. A mountain is on fire. In fact, there's one across the mountains from where I live that you can see all this smoke. And then you're thinking about something cold in that location. You can't see the fire, but you see smoke. And you know that cold cannot be there because you see this huge cloud of smoke, even though you don't see the fire directly, right? You can't see the direct opposite of cold, which is fire or heat. So in that case, it's indirect. And that is not covered in your reading. So there is a kachik, a syllogism, where they say, is there anything which is not a contradiction? And they can't find it. And remember that no one thing is a contradiction ever, but everything that exists will eventually be involved in a contradiction. And if you've been alive long enough, you'll know that. You will have experienced that already, right? So we're going to go on to talk about relationships, right? We did contradictions. Now we're moving on to relationships. We're moving, in fact, through this Dura at a rapid pace, an unprecedented speed. So just hang on. It's like galloping a horse across the Mongolian steppes, right? Just hold on. So there are two kinds of relationships. Say dakchik, gidrelwa. Dakchik, gidrelwa. Chik means one. Dakchik means one being or oneself. Gi is of, and drelwa is relationship. Right? So it means the kind of relationship to be one thing is to automatically be the other thing. And we use, Geshe gets onto this thing about using language that everybody can understand, because sometimes when you read a very scholarly book, they they use a phrase that might be one selflessness is, or something like that. And we don't do that. We're freed by having to be university scholars in that sense. We don't have anybody to impress. We just want to get the meaning across. And he calls this dishwasher language. So remember and look at who your crowd is, who you're talking to, and adjust the language for that. So the meaning of the thing is just a relationship which is such that to be one of the things is automatically to be the other thing, right? Let's call it a relationship of singles. No, let's not call it that. That's too awkward. So we have to find common ground. You know, the rule in Buddhist logic is that we must find common ground. And it begins with common language and common words. Words that people that you're talking to can understand. So what is, I'm sorry. I think I ate too much cheese yesterday and I have all this phlegm in my throat. So what is the relationship between Mitapa and Chepa? The relationship between a changing thing and a thing which is made. It is dakchik drawa. It's a relationship such that to be one is automatically to be the other, right? Anytime you're a changing thing, you're automatically a made thing. Anytime you're a thing which is made, you're automatically a changing thing. It's a two-way relationship, such that to be one is to be the other automatically. This is what we call a relationship of identity. But what about this picture, right? What about this picture? A car and a Toyota. It is a one-way or two-way relationship. What is it? So Nomvu says, let me just scroll back up in the chat. A rose is a flower. Is that a one-way relationship or a two-way relationship? Good example. To be a rose is to be a flower. But are all flowers roses? To be a Toyota is automatically to be a car. But to be a car is not automatically to be a Toyota. So with the rose example and the Toyota example, it doesn't go both ways. And this is a second example of a relationship of identity. Yupa, mitapa, tangel. Yupa is an existing thing. Mitapa is a changing thing. Tang means and, gel, we know means contradiction. So it goes like this. Being all existing things is contradictory to being something which is changing. That's how we have to translate this sentence. All existing things is contradictory to being something which is changing. Being all existing things is contradictory to being changing thing. But reverse it, being a changing thing is not contradictory to being an existing thing. Again, it's a one-way relationship of being one to being automatically the other. You have to think about it. Right? Being all existing things is contradictory to being a changing thing. All existing things is not a thing which is a subset. Back to Chi and Chichedrak, right? Or which is equal to the set of all changing things. Although the opposite of is true. Although changing things are a subset of existence itself. And for this, you have to know a rule of logic, that if a set includes both changing and unchanging things, we consider it unchanging. All existing things includes things which are changing and things which are unchanging. And then we consider it unchanging. But if we say all existing things, we're also sort of stating a general truth again, in the sense that it's unchanging. It will always include those many objects, whether they happen to be around or not at any given moment. The isness of the universe is unchanging. Like the stuff that's in that shoebox universe, right? This may be changing or unchanging, but the box, the shoebox itself, which holds it, is unchanging. That is Utpala Tangel. Being a changing thing is not contradictory to being existing things. But being existing things is contradictory to being a changing thing. It is a one-way relationship, like the Toyota and the car, and the rose and the flower. And both Venerable Utpala and I are giving you this structure, right? And the syntax of the word is difficult, especially in Tibetan. But it comes up often in the Madhyamika scriptures. And this is referring to the section on contradictions. And as we get more and more familiar with this structure, you will then be able to begin to read and understand Arya Nagarjuna or Tsongkhapa or Master Shantideva on emptiness or anybody else. We need to understand these structures. All right, here's the Bumpa. They use Bumpa in the scriptures a lot because every house or room has a water jug in ancient India. Right now we have faucets where we turn on water. But before, somebody had to go to the well or the spring to get water. And it would stay cold in this beautiful clay pot. So it was something that was always around. So say Bumpa. Bumpe Dokpa. Bumpa, Bumpe Dokpa. So Bumpa and Bumpe Topa is a good example for a relationship such that one thing is automatically the other. So this is also getting you prepared for your homework. Bumpa, as I said, means water pitcher. Bumpe Dopa, though, it's a tricky meaning. It's the reverse of all that is not. The reverse of all that a thing is not. So what's the reverse of all that this pen is not? Right, pen. It's the pen. But Bumpe Topa is not the same as Bumpa. Pen and the opposite of all which the pen is not. Pen and Topa mean the reverse of all that the thing is not. And it's very important, this Topa in this school, because according to them, you perceive things by eliminating all that the thing is not. And then you perceive the thing. When I first heard this, and I still think about it every time I go into the parking lot of the supermarket and look for my car. I am eliminating everything that my car isn't, right? It's not that one, not that one, not that one. And then I come up with my car, right? Some Tibetan Buddhist schools have mistaken that for emptiness. So the minute that you are a pen, you are automatically the opposite of all that the pen is not. They are two separate things. They are two things distinct from one another. Do they refer to the same thing? Yes. They're distinct. The opposite of all that the pen is not is distinct from the pen. Are they the same thing? Yes. And when you perceive the reversal of the pen, this is what Geshe calls it, the reversal, the opposite of all that it is not, you're excluding the opposite of the exclusion of all that the pen is not. When you perceive the pen, you're just perceiving the exclusion of all the pen is not. When you perceive the exclusion of all the pen is not, again, you're perceiving the exclusion of all that is not the exclusion of all that the pen is not. You're going to have to dissect that, right? And go through it and think about it. And we have to get used to thinking like this, because if our mind isn't into it, if your mind isn't sharp enough to handle this, then you're going to have trouble with emptiness. So we got to buckle down. We got to read these syllogisms, these kachikmas, and be able to get through them fluently. One or two, if you want to see emptiness directly. So what do? We start slowly. We just keep thinking about it and discussing it and reading it and dissecting it. And it works on our minds until, and plant the 4 seeds, until one day it becomes clear. So we're not just talking about words. word games by logicians in a college or something like that. Your mind has to be able to quickly move to those things so that you can perceive emptiness directly. The distinction is important because to understand how you perceive the pen, you have to be able to perceive the second one, which is that how you perceive the pen is by excluding all which is not the pen. Nominally, they are distinct. Conceptually, they are distinct. But when we're ontologically, they're not distinct. I don't know if you all know the word ontological in your own language, but it means of or relating to the essence or the nature of being the same material stuff. But they're thought about, they're conceived through a different process. So the second kind of relationship is Daejung Gidrel, which is a cause and effect relationship, if you want to say it easily. Daejung means came from it. So the relationship of a thing and the thing which it came from. The relationship between a thing and the thing which it came from, right? This is not a two-way relationship. We talked about that, right? We're talking about a relationship of the thing with the thing which it came from, and not the relationship of a thing which is about to produce a thing which doesn't exist. Remember, that can't be a relationship because they're not distinct. They're not two distinct objects because one of them isn't an object yet. So cause and effect, it can be a one-way relationship. And then you get into a very nasty debate. By the time the tree's there, the seed's not there. So you don't have two distinct objects. So there's not two objects. So you can't have a relationship. So then we have to say over a period of time or something like that. Conceptually, when you speak of the thing's result, you assume you're talking about the cause in the same breath. By the time you call a thing a result, you're also conceptualizing its cause. It's technically true that at the instant that the result is there, the cause is already gone. And we can speak of a relationship over a period of time. We can still say Roxana over a whole period of her life. We can say in her whole life, she's only eaten once. Even though all of the Roxanas from the millisecond that we're talking about and back don't exist anymore. They're gone. All those previous moments. We can still say whether or not she's eaten something because we can still consider Roxana over the length of her lifetime. That's all. That's all. So an example of two things which share a Daejung Gidrelwe, a one-way relationship. Say Nupoi, Chilok, Sujungwe, Nupo. Nupo means working thing, any working thing. Chi means later. Lok means, it means like to flip a pancake. So Chilok, the thing that flops over into the next moment. So Chilok Si Jungwa means a working thing in the moment after it. Working thing as it will exist in the next millisecond. Millisecond number 2. The flop over of a working thing, millisecond number 1, Jungwa means happened, right? Chilok means flop. So it flops over in the millisecond number 2. So now we're into the second instance of the thing in its second instant. It shares a relationship of having come from something else, with Nupo meaning the original working thing. Pen of the millisecond number 2 shares a Daejungi Drelwe, a one-way relationship, with the pen of millisecond number 1. We cannot say that pen millisecond number 1 shares a relationship with pen of millisecond number 2 because that millisecond hasn't happened yet. It doesn't exist yet. So they say at that moment in millisecond number 2, you can be considering the entire duration. And that's why I brought up Roxana in the length of her life. It doesn't matter how much length of life you talk about when you're talking about Roxana tomorrow, because that can't be included in the length of life yet, because it hasn't happened yet, right? It's a fine point, which is okay. So you can consider as a group the milliseconds of the present and the past together. You cannot consider as a group the milliseconds of the present and the future going forward together, because the future don't exist yet. It's as simple as that. They have never existed, and that's the relationship. So a working thing which flips over later into the second moment of the working thing. Oh, one more piece of it. A working thing in the moment after it and the original working thing. Okay, come on. There we go. So there are 3 criteria for that relationship. And again, you might want to take note of this. It's on your homework. 1, they should be Dakni Chikpa. To be one is to be the same thing, or to be one thing is to automatically be the other thing. The trick here is that something which is a changing thing is a Dakni Chik with something which is a changing thing. But they don't have a relationship because there's not 2 separate things. To be one, the same thing, Dakni Chikpa, it's the same thing. You can say the same thing as Katie is the same thing as Katie, but they don't share a relationship because they're not separate. So far, we don't have all of the required characteristic. The first one is that they should be the same thing. there are some other correct characteristics here. Second one, tade. They must be separate things, right? They need to be separate from each other, which means that Katie can't have a relationship with Katie. Not this kind of relationship. Should be separate things. And the third one is Chude mena kyumegu, right? Chude means that thing. So take, for example, cars. Let's say that chude means that thing, meaning cars, okay? For example, those cars. Mena means if they seek to exist, kyu, here means then this thing, like meaning Toyotas, megu, would have to cease to exist. If one thing ceased to exist, then the other thing would also have to cease to exist. If all cars cease to exist, all Toyotas cease to exist. But of course, it doesn't work the other way, right? So these three requirements for the relationship to hold between objects. They should be the same thing. I mean, car and Toyota, they are cars in a sense. They should be separate, car and Toyota. And if you wiped out all the cars in the world, you'd have to wipe out all the Toyotas, number 3. So that's the test of whether they share this relationship. That's a general description of 3 qualities that you'd have to have for them to share a relationship, such that to be one is to be the other. Dakni Chikpe Drella. This is your formal logic. We are deep into it, and we've covered 2 kinds of correct reasons. One involved a relationship of identity, one involved a relationship of cause and effect. So, Mamikpe Takyang Dak, a correct reason to prove an absence. And this phrase is Mamikpe Takyang Dak is difficult to translate. You know Lama Tsongkhapa's mantra, Mikme Tsewe Ter Chen Rezi. So Mikme means not perceived. Ma Mikpa means not perceived. Tak, if you remember, means a reason. Yang Dak means a correct reason. So it is a correct reason to prove the absence of something. And we have 3 kinds of correct reasons. One is where the correct reason involves the nature of the object, of the other object. One is where the correct reason has a cause and effect relationship with the other object. And here we have a correct reason for proving that something isn't there. And this is so important that it's treated as a separate kind of reason. It's split off. So you can't have the other 2 relationships because we're trying to prove an absence. An absence can't have a relationship. Emptiness is an absence. But let's take it to something a little more, that appears a little more on solid ground. Consider everyone in their room on this Zoom call. I'm going to guess that nobody in their room has a valid perception of a hungry ghost. Because everybody in their room, we don't know. Meaning, if you prove that no one in their room has had the cause or a cause of knowing about hungry ghosts, then you can say, they don't know about hungry ghosts. If no one in their room has perceived a hungry ghost with a valid perception, then we can say nobody in their room could ever have a valid memory of a hungry ghost. Or the following would be a proof. Consider everybody in the room. It would be improper for anyone in the room to say that hungry ghosts exist if no one in the room had had a valid perception of them. And this is classic, right? So what is the reverse necessity here? What is the general truth that we're saying here? If a Buddhist has not had a valid perception of a hungry ghost, then a Buddhist would never go around telling people, oh, hungry ghosts exist. That's the implication. It's very powerful. And that's a classic Mamikpe Takyangdak. It's a proof for proving the absence of something. What's absent in our room? The correctness of swearing that hungry ghosts exist because you've had a valid perception. It's not present in your room. If no one in the room has had a valid perception of a hungry ghost. So we're talking about rightness. It wouldn't be right for someone in their room to swear that they exist if they have not had a valid perception of them. And that's an airtight Mamikpe Takyangdak in Buddhism. As a Buddhist, you cannot assert the presence of a thing until you've had a sema or a pramana about the thing. And that has implications to how we present Buddhism to other people. Minawa Mamikpe Takyangdak. The main thing here is Minawa. Mamikpe Takyangdak we already had, right? Yangdak means correct, tak means reason, for proving Mamikpe, the absence of something. Technically speaking, it's not always an absence. It can be not being something. But this is what it's called, okay? It's called that, although it's not always for an absence. It can be something not being something else. So, Minangwa, generally speaking, means the thing that you are denying. So what was I denying before? The correctness of any Buddhist who hasn't had a pramana or valid perception about hungry ghosts. If you talk about it logically, you can say, logically, I believe hungry ghosts exist. But if you haven't had a pramana about it, a direct valid perception, then you can't, right? So getting up and saying hungry ghosts must exist, what am I denying? The correctness of saying that hungry ghosts exist if I haven't seen them, or if I can't prove them in any other way, right? And we're running out of time. And then, so for the last formal logic for today, and I see, thank you, Venerable Utpala, for fixing my Tibetan. Didn't have time to do that earlier, so thank you so much. Looking forward to fixing it. Number 2, Wrong room, mamikpe tak yang tak. Non-room means the thing can appear to the normal perceptions of your opponent. So we're talking about a correct reason for proving the absence of something involving a thing which is perceptible to the other person. It's not like it's some difficult thing to perceive. It's not whether Roxana has perceived emptiness directly or whether or not there's a hungry ghost perception here or something like that. It's more like, consider the top of this pen. There's no car there because there's no Toyota there, right? It's obvious. That's a non-rumma mikpe tak yang tak. You don't have to be a person with ESP to perceive the truth of that. A normal human being on this Zoom call or in this room who knows what a Toyota is and what a car is can perceive that. So it's a reason for proving an absence, right, of something which is something which could appear to the valid perceptions of a normal opponent. Okay, that was the last piece of formal logic here today. And thank you, Venerable Utpala, for sharing the correct Tibetan type. I appreciate that so much because I don't know. She's my great editor and supporter in this. So we're going to go on to debate it just a little bit here. So in the debate ground, you know, a great debater will try to confuse and distract their opponent. And we can use that tactic, right? To get our opponent so confused and distracted that you can lead them to at least your understanding, right? So we're not trying to be competitive or win. We're trying to help each other focus our mind on the statement given while in the middle of chaos. So here's a picture of Kendra and I debating many years ago at Diamond Mountain. We did debate after class for, I think, 3 nights a week, at least 2 nights a week. And while you're debating, you're searching for a quick response and you need to focus and concentrate. And so the person who's attacking you is trying to get you not to focus and concentrate. And through this practicing of concentration, like it's like focusing on a complicated chess game or something, you will be able to have clear focus in other situations in the future. So if you are the attacker, then you are creating tension and stress. You are harassing the other debater, but they are unshakable in their concentration. And it's a great important skill for meditating as well. Like when you're trying to meditate in the middle of the city and the garbage truck comes by, right? Or an emergency vehicle with a siren, right? So there's a whole bunch of different ways to respond. And Geshe put a list of them in your reading. He went to Ken Rinpoche and he said, kind of like me when I go to Venerable Utpala, how do you spell all these things? Because nobody in the monastery knows, right? They're just things that people have always said during debates. And they could mean 3 or 4 different things. And Ken Rinpoche said, I don't know. And he was the abbot of Saramay Monastery, maybe the greatest debater. He was a Larampa Geshe. And he says, I don't know. So they sat down together and they worked out what they probably used to mean or something like that. They've taken on new meaning. Nobody thinks of them as a word anymore. They're just things you say when you get the person in a corner, and then you say it. It's just the emotion of the thing. So when I had this class with Geshe, he got 2 people to do the debate. And we don't have that possibility to do that here this morning. So I'm just going to try and run through quickly a couple of the syllogisms and their responses, the attacker and the defender, okay? So di chi tar chu chen, you drop your, if you're in robes, which this happens in the monastery, but now we get to do it out of the monastery, lay people. You would go, drop your robe and go up very sweetly and whisper into somebody's ear, di chi tar chu chen. How about this one? Right? There's no different divisions of contradictions. And the defender would say, Tank Madru. That's not correct. And then you come back and you confirm. Are you telling me that there are divisions of galwas, of contradictions? Duh, yes. Don't say duh until you are ready, right? So the first tactic is a stalling tactic. And you say, la or which means, what are you saying? La means, I didn't quite catch what you said. It's a little more polite than, huh? And they are in your reading. So what you could do in that few seconds while they're repeating what they said is you can think really fast what to say. Are you telling me that there are divisions of contradictions? Duh. Show. Sounds like, like show it. Show. Direct and indirect. Are you telling me direct contradiction and indirect contradiction are the 2 main divisions? Duh. Yeah. Otsa. That's another thing you got to learn. Say otsa. So there are 2 versions in the monastery. One is notsa and the other one's otsa. Notsa, if you've studied mental afflictions or bodhisattva vows, notsa means to be ashamed or to be embarrassed. So what you're saying is you should be ashamed to give an answer like that, right? Are you telling me that's the division? Duh. No, it's not. Because the gel is pensun pengel tang. Lenchik mine gel. Right? That's it. What are those in English? A contradiction where 2 things are mutually exclusive and a contradiction where 2 things are diametrically opposed. That's the real divisions. Takma droop. Your reason's not correct. And this is an easy way to learn debate in Tibet. You can also say kyabalong. Kyabalong means give me the kyaba. Give me your new, messed up, stupid kyaba. Answer. And you'll see that you're wrong, okay? Kyabalong. So, sorry if I'm going too fast. I'm watching the clock. An example would be, those are the 2 main, I would say, those are the 2 main divisions of Gyalwas, contradictions. and the defender, but those aren't the main divisions of Gelwa. Just because they're the main divisions doesn't mean it's the kind of Gelwa or something like that. And it's indefensible. It's an indefensible statement of necessity. So when you think they're getting close to one, you say, Kya belong? You get them in a corner and you say, Kya belong? Give me your stupid Kaba. Right? Consider sound. It must so be a changing thing because it's a thing which is made. And that's true because anything which is made is always a changing thing. It's incorrect to say that. All right, then give me your statement of necessity. Kya belong? Come on, lapta, say something already. You say yinbei cheer, and they sit there and they go, right? That's me. And then you say lapta. And then everybody in the background they're usually people sitting around you who are kind of helping both parties. And they start and they go, oh, stop. And it's whether they're right or wrong, right? And it's a good way to buy time. 50% of the people who join you haven't even been listening. And they don't know if the person said something stupid or not. But then it looks like they're wrong and they're not wrong. But that's kind of how it goes. And there are more examples of debate, but we don't have time for them today. I'm sorry. And then there's a list here. And again, I'm going to lean on Venerable Utpala to help me with this. And then I'll post it later. These are some of the replies, right? And la, what did you say? Shok, show me. De cheer, come on, show it. Notsa, you should be ashamed of yourself. Kyabalum, give me the statement of necessity. Lapta, say something. Lapta. Stop stalling. Korti korsum, you just made a big circle. For example, you accept that made sounds must be changing, right? But you refuse to accept that sound is changing. Therefore, you must be crazy. You've led them to the answer, and then they still hold to their position that they've accepted sounds must be changing, but they don't accept that sound is changing. So, korti korsum, you must be crazy. You just made a big circle. Okay. And the meditation for this week or this class is to think of someone who irritates you. Make up a complete logical statement that has 3 parts and the 3 relationships to prove to yourself that you cannot really know if they have a certain good quality or not. Let's put this into real life, how we can use what we've learned today, right? And let's offer a perfect world where we stop judging others. Isn't that kind of how we started logic? Lord Buddha said you cannot judge others if you are not me or someone like me, because you will surely fall. And using our logic to get to these deeper things, using all of this structure and form. And again, just to remind you that this is something to use for the rest of your life. It's not like a one done deal. I've done ACI 13, I'm done with that. This will help you in everything in your life. So let's offer this perfect world that we're creating to every being in all the universes. Here is the great earth, filled with the smell of incense, covered with a blanket of flowers. The great mountain, the 4 continents, wearing a jewel of the sun and moon. In my mind, I make them the paradise of a Buddha and offer it all to you. By this deed, may every living being experience the pure world. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. And by the goodness of what we have just done, may all beings complete the collection of merit and wisdom, and thus gain the 2 ultimate bodies that merit and wisdom make. And thank you, everybody. Just want to let you know that Venerable Utpala, I will be teaching the next 3 classes, the last 3 classes. And I will not be here on Thursday, but I hope to be back, plan to be back the next Sunday and Thursday. This following Thursday, I will be out of town. And I hope you have a good week. And thank you, Venerable Utpala, for having my back and putting the Tibetan in there. And as I said, I will go into the PDF for all of you and post it, and you will get it fairly soon after I fix my Tibetan. I use the Tibetan that was in the readings, and the readings need a little editing and correcting. So I really appreciate that. And have a good rest of your week. See you soon. Bye. I love to look at all your faces. See who's here. Hi, Anna. Hi, Mike. Barbara. Irina. Daria. Oh, hi. Chong. Ready. Bye-bye.